My name is Rebecca, and I learned the hard way that death does not just take away the people you love. It also reveals who your family really is underneath their masks of civility. This is the story of how my sister-in-law tried to rob my children of their future, and how I made sure she paid for every greedy scheme she hatched. It all started 3 months ago when my father-in-law, Harold, passed away at the age of 78. Harold was not just a father to my husband Marcus. He was the cornerstone of our entire family. A self-made millionaire who built his fortune from nothing, Harold owned multiple properties, had substantial investments, and most importantly, he adored his 3 grandchildren. My twins Emma and Ethan, who are now 16, and my youngest daughter Lily, who just turned 12. Harold had always been clear about his intentions. He wanted his wealth to secure his grandchildren's futures, college funds, trust accounts, the works. He had even shown Marcus and me the preliminary will documents 2 years before his death. Each grandchild was set to receive equal portions of his estate when they turned 21, with smaller amounts available for education expenses starting at 18. It was a generous, thoughtful plan that would ensure our kids never had to struggle the way Harold did in his youth. But Harold had one weakness, his daughter Victoria. Victoria is my husband's older sister, 45 years old, twice divorced, and perpetually in some kind of financial crisis. She had never held a steady job for more than 2 years, constantly bouncing between get-rich-quick schemes and failed business ventures. Despite this, Harold had always bailed her out, paying for her apartments, her cars, her credit card debts, and even her legal fees from her messy divorces. The problem was that Victoria had grown accustomed to being Harold's financial safety net, and she expected that arrangement to continue even after his death. The day after Harold's funeral, Victoria called a family meeting. She sat in Harold's leather chair, the one he had specifically told the grandchildren would someday be theirs to fight over, and announced that she had some important information to share. "I know Dad's death has been hard on all of us," she began, dabbing her eyes with a tissue that somehow never seemed to actually touch her perfectly applied makeup. "But we need to discuss practical matters. I have been going through his papers, and there are some complications with the will." Marcus and I exchanged glances. Complications? Harold had been meticulous about his legal affairs. He had worked with the same estate attorney for over 20 years. "What kind of complications?" Marcus asked. Victoria sighed dramatically. "Well, it turns out Dad was quite concerned about the children's futures. He worried that inheriting large sums at such young ages might not be beneficial for their character development." My stomach began to sink. "According to his final wishes," Victoria continued, "he decided that the money should be held in trust by a family member who could make mature decisions about when and how it gets distributed. Someone with life experience and financial wisdom." "And let me guess," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "He chose you as that trustee?" Victoria's smile was thin and cold. "He knew I would make the hard decisions that a parent might be too emotional to make. After all, I do not have children of my own to show favoritism toward." Marcus stood up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. "That is complete garbage, Victoria. Dad would never put you in charge of the kids' inheritance. He knew about your financial problems." "Marcus, please," Victoria said, pulling out a document. "I understand this is emotional, but here is the updated will. Dad signed it just 6 weeks before he passed away." She handed us a copy of what appeared to be Harold's will, dated recent enough to be legitimate. My hands shook as I read through the legal language, but the meaning was clear. Victoria had been named as the sole trustee of the children's inheritance, with full discretionary power over distributions. But something felt wrong. The language was different from what Harold had shown us before. More formal, more distant. And there was no mention of the college fund provisions that Harold had been so excited about. "I want to see the original," I said. "This is the original," Victoria replied. "Well, a certified copy. The original is with Dad's attorney, of course." "Then we are going to the attorney," Marcus declared. Victoria's expression flickered, just for a moment, but I caught it. Fear? Guilt? Whatever it was, it confirmed my suspicions that something was very wrong. The next morning, Marcus and I sat in the office of Harold's attorney, David Crane, who had handled Harold's legal affairs for over 2 decades. David was a distinguished man in his 60s, with the kind of calm demeanor that comes from dealing with grieving families and complicated estates. "I have to be honest with you," David said after we explained Victoria's claims. "This is highly unusual." Harold was very specific about his wishes regarding the grandchildren. He wanted direct distributions to them, not a discretionary trust managed by Victoria. "But she has a will," I said, sliding the document across his desk. David examined the papers carefully, his frown deepening with each page. After several minutes, he looked up at us with a grave expression. "This is not the will I prepared for your father," he said to Marcus. "The signature looks correct, but everything else, the language, the structure, even the formatting, this is not from my office." My heart began pounding. "Are you saying this is fake?" "I am saying this is not the document Harold and I finalized. The real will, which we completed and filed properly, leaves the bulk of the estate directly to the grandchildren, exactly as Harold intended. There is a small bequest to Victoria, $50,000, but nothing like what this document suggests." Marcus was turning red with anger. "So she forged it?" "I cannot make that determination," David said carefully. "But I can tell you that this document holds no legal weight. The real will is properly filed and witnessed. However, if Victoria is claiming otherwise, we may need to involve law enforcement." That evening, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about Victoria sitting in Harold's chair, lying to our faces about his final wishes, trying to steal our children's future. But I also kept thinking about how confident she had seemed, how prepared. This was not a spur-of-the-moment scheme. This was calculated. I decided to do some investigating of my own. The next day, while Marcus was at work and the kids were at school, I drove to Harold's house. Victoria had been staying there since the funeral, claiming she needed time to sort through his belongings. I still had a key from when we used to check on Harold during his final months. I let myself in quietly and began searching. I was not sure what I was looking for, but I knew Victoria well enough to know she would have kept evidence of her planning somewhere. I found it in Harold's study, in a box Victoria had apparently been packing. There were multiple draft versions of fake wills, practice copies of Harold's signature, and most damning of all, printed emails between Victoria and someone named Jenny, who appeared to be helping her with the forgery. One email made my blood run cold. "The signature looks good, but you need to work on making the legal language sound more authentic. Remember, the goal is to make it confusing enough that they just accept your authority as trustee rather than fighting it. The kids are young, the parents are grieving. They will likely just go along with it if you sound confident enough. Once you have control of the money, you can figure out the rest later." Another email was even worse. "Jenny, I know it sounds harsh, but those kids have had everything handed to them their whole lives. A little financial struggle will build character. Besides, Dad would want me to be taken care of first. I am his actual child, not some grandkids who barely visited him." I took pictures of everything with my phone, my hands shaking with rage. But I was not done investigating. I spent the next 2 hours going through Harold's personal papers and found something that made Victoria's betrayal even more heinous. Hidden in his desk was a handwritten letter addressed to the grandchildren, dated just a week before his death. "My dearest Emma, Ethan, and Lily, by the time you read this, I will be gone, but I want you to know how proud I am of each of you. Emma, your kindness and creativity inspire me every day. Ethan, your curiosity and intelligence remind me so much of myself at your age. And Lily, your laughter has been the brightest light in my final years. I have made sure that you will all be taken care of, that you can pursue your dreams without the financial worries that held me back when I was young. Remember that this money comes with responsibility. Use it wisely, help others when you can, and never forget that your greatest inheritance is not what I am leaving you, but who you choose to become. All my love, Grandpa Harold." Tears were streaming down my face as I photographed the letter. Harold had been thinking of his grandchildren until the very end, and Victoria was trying to steal not just their money, but their grandfather's final loving words. But I was far from finished with my investigation. Over the next week, I dove deeper into Victoria's scheme. I contacted Jenny from the emails, pretending to be a friend of Victoria's who was interested in similar estate planning services. It turned out Jenny was a paralegal who had been fired from multiple law firms for ethical violations. For the right price, she helped people create convincing fake legal documents. Jenny, not knowing who I really was, bragged about the Harold Richardson job. That was how she referred to my father-in-law's case. She told me how Victoria had paid her $5,000 to create the fake will, and had promised her another $10,000 once the estate was settled. The best part, Jenny told me over coffee, is that the family is so trusting. They did not even question it when Victoria showed them the paperwork. People never expect their own family members to screw them over that badly. I recorded our entire conversation, but I still was not ready to play my hand. I wanted to know exactly how deep this scheme went and what Victoria's ultimate plan was. I started monitoring Victoria's social media and discovered she had been living quite lavishly for someone who claimed to be broke. Designer handbags, expensive dinners, a new lease on a luxury apartment. All funded, I suspected, by money she had already stolen from Harold's accounts while he was sick. Then I found the smoking gun. A text message conversation between Victoria and her friend Rachel that Victoria had accidentally posted as a screenshot on her Instagram story before quickly deleting it. But I had taken a screenshot of the screenshot. Rachel, are you sure this will work? What if they find out? Victoria, they will not. Marcus is too trusting, and Rebecca is too busy with the kids to ask the right questions. By the time they figure anything out, I will have transferred everything to offshore accounts. Let them try to prove anything then. Rachel, what about the kids' college funds? Victoria, what about them? Those brats have their whole lives to figure out college. I am 45 and this is my last chance to actually have some security. Harold owed me this money anyway. I put up with his lectures about responsibility for decades. That was it. I had everything I needed. But instead of going straight to the police, I decided Victoria deserved to experience the same kind of betrayal she had planned for my children. I was going to make sure her downfall was as public and humiliating as possible. First, I called a family meeting, just like Victoria had done. I invited not just Marcus and Victoria, but also Harold's brother George, his sister Margaret, and several close family friends who had been asking about the estate. I told everyone I had some important updates about Harold's will. Victoria showed up looking smug and confident, probably thinking I was going to announce that we were accepting her authority as trustee. Thank you all for coming, I began, standing in Harold's living room where this nightmare had started. I know there has been some confusion about Harold's final wishes, and I wanted to clear everything up. Victoria smiled. Of course, Rebecca. I know this has been difficult to accept, but Dad really did think. Actually, Victoria, I interrupted. I want to start by sharing something Harold wrote shortly before he died. I pulled out Harold's handwritten letter to the grandchildren and began reading it aloud. By the time I finished, there was not a dry eye in the room, except for Victoria's. She looked like she was about to be sick. That is beautiful, Margaret said softly. It sounds exactly like Harold. It does, I agreed. Which is why I was so surprised when Victoria presented us with a will that contradicted everything Harold had told us about his wishes for the grandchildren. Victoria started to speak, but I held up my hand. So I did some investigating. I pulled out the printed emails between Victoria and Jenny. These are communications between Victoria and a paralegal named Jenny Martinez, discussing the creation of fraudulent will documents. The room went completely silent as I read the most damning emails aloud. Victoria's face went from pale to green. That is not. Someone must have hacked my email, Victoria stammered. Really? I said. Because I also have this recorded conversation with Jenny, where she describes the Harold Richardson job in detail. I played the recording on my phone. Jenny's voice filled the room as she bragged about helping Victoria create fake documents and steal from a grieving family. George, Harold's brother, stood up slowly. At 75, he was a retired judge, and his voice carried the weight of decades of legal authority. Victoria, he said quietly. Do you understand what you have done? Victoria was now crying. Not the calculated tears she had shed at Harold's funeral, but genuine panic and shame. Uncle George, I can explain. You forged legal documents. You attempted to defraud your brother's family. You tried to steal from children. His voice grew stronger with each word. Harold is rolling over in his grave. But I was not finished. There is more, I said, pulling out my phone again. Victoria, would you like to explain to everyone what you meant when you texted your friend Rachel about transferring money to offshore accounts? I read the text conversation aloud, including Victoria's dismissive comments about those brats, and her belief that Harold owed her the money. The room erupted. Margaret started crying. George was shaking with anger. Marcus looked like he wanted to punch a wall. Several of the family friends got up and walked out without saying a word. But the best part was Victoria's complete meltdown. She went from denial to anger to desperate bargaining in the span of about 5 minutes. You do not understand, she sobbed. I have debts. I have bills. I have been struggling for years while Dad just gave and gave to everyone else's kids. What about me? What about my future? What about my children's future? I shot back. What about the grandfather who loved them and wanted to provide for them? What about Harold's actual wishes instead of your greed? I never meant for it to go this far, Victoria wailed. I just needed some time to get back on my feet. I was going to give them money eventually. After you had spent it all on designer handbags and luxury apartments? I pulled out printouts of her social media posts showing her recent spending sprees. You have been living high on the hog while claiming to be broke, Victoria. This was never about need, this was about greed. George stood up again. Victoria, as Harold's brother and as a former judge, I am telling you that you have 2 choices. You can return every penny you have taken, cooperate fully with the proper administration of Harold's real will, and hope that your brother and sister-in-law decide not to press criminal charges. Or you can continue with this charade and face the full consequences of wire fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. Victoria's sobs grew louder. Elder abuse? Dad was not abused. You stole from a sick, dying man and forged his signature, George said coldly. In any court in the country, that is elder abuse. The meeting ended with Victoria agreeing to return the money she had already taken, and to cooperate with the proper estate proceedings. But I was not about to let her off that easily. Over the next month, I made sure everyone in Harold's social circle knew exactly what Victoria had attempted to do. I shared the evidence with Harold's church congregation, his business associates, his neighbors, and every family member I could contact. I wanted Victoria to understand that actions have consequences, and that trying to steal from children makes you a pariah. The social consequences were swift and brutal. Victoria was asked to leave Harold's church. Her country club membership was revoked. Former friends stopped returning her calls. She even lost a potential job when her prospective employer Googled her name and found out about the scandal. But the legal consequences were even more satisfying. Despite Victoria's cooperation, Marcus and I decided to press charges anyway. We had consulted with a criminal attorney who explained that Victoria's crimes were too serious to ignore, and that letting her off with just returning the money would send the wrong message. Victoria was arrested and charged with multiple felonies: forgery, fraud, attempted theft, and elder abuse. The local newspaper picked up the story, running a headline that read, "Local woman charged with forging father's will to steal grandchildren's inheritance." The article included Victoria's mugshot and detailed the evidence against her. It was shared hundreds of times on social media, ensuring that Victoria's shame was not just local but widely public. At Victoria's arraignment, she pled not guilty, apparently still believing she could talk her way out of the consequences. Her attorney, a public defender, since Victoria could no longer afford private counsel after returning Harold's money, tried to argue that this was a family dispute, not a criminal matter. The judge was not having it. "Ms. Richardson," the judge said sternly, "you are accused of forging legal documents and attempting to defraud 3 minor children of their inheritance. This is not a family dispute. This is a crime. You will stand trial." The trial took place 4 months later, and it was everything I had hoped for. The prosecution presented our evidence methodically. The forged documents, the recorded conversation with Jenny, the text messages, the financial records showing Victoria's spending sprees. Victoria's defense was pathetic. Her attorney tried to argue that she was overwhelmed by grief and made poor decisions, But the premeditation was too clear. The emails with Jenny showed months of planning. The fake signature practice sheets showed deliberate preparation. The text messages about offshore accounts showed intent to permanently steal the money. Most damaging of all was Jenny's testimony. Facing her own criminal charges, Jenny had agreed to cooperate with the prosecution. She testified about Victoria's coldness and calculation, describing how Victoria had laughed about fooling those gullible parents and had bragged about finally getting what she deserved. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. At sentencing, I was allowed to give a victim impact statement. I stood in front of that courtroom and told the judge about Harold's love for his grandchildren, about the letter he had written them, about the dreams he had for their futures. I described how Victoria's greed had not just stolen money, but had robbed the children of their grandfather's final gift of love and security. Your Honor, I concluded, Victoria did not just try to steal money. She tried to steal my children's future, their education, their opportunities, and their grandfather's love. She tried to replace Harold's generosity with her own selfishness. She deserves every consequence that comes her way. Victoria was sentenced to 4 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution for all legal fees and court costs. The judge also imposed a permanent restraining order preventing her from having any contact with my children. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was not legal at all. 6 months after Victoria's conviction, I received a call from Harold's attorney, David Crane. He had discovered something interesting while going through Harold's safety deposit box. Rebecca, he said, I think you should know that Harold was aware of Victoria's financial problems and her sense of entitlement. He actually changed his will specifically to prevent her from interfering with the grandchildren's inheritance.